Okay, so as I said, I'm Andrew Norton, Higher Education Program Director at the Grattan Institute. You've probably heard this several times, so I'm not talking about higher education. I did it last year. So we've got three speakers, two of whom are principally talking about schools-related issues, and the third is talking about universities. First up, going across the panel, we've got Sasha Uher, who's a history and business studies teacher, but well known in libertarian circles. Going back to her time as a Liberal student, President of the Australian Liberal Students Federation, and has been campus coordinator for the IPA's Generation Liberty. Trisha, who also has a long history in libertarianism, was at the Uber Libertarian of the Year last year, a great honour, and is currently working for the Centre for Independent Studies. And finally, Claire Lehmann, who is a writer and an editor who has written in numerous publications, and she's the founder and editor of Grattan magazine, which focuses on science, politics, and free speech advocacy.
Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about teacher accreditation and the government's moves to try and professionalise the teaching profession, which up until this point couldn't really consider to be a profession. So to start off with, I'm going to go through the standards and a bit of nitty-gritty on how it works, and then at the end my reflections on it. So essentially they're trying to move towards like a accounting model where accountants are accredited with CPA or CA, where with teachers you have to meet certain standards to gain your accreditation. So I'm going to talk about a few different organisations today, and they've all got their lovely acronyms. The first one is BOSTES. This is the new term for the Board of Studies. They merged with the Institute of Teachers, and they're responsible for implementing the standards in New South Wales as well as curriculum here. So this is what they describe as what the standards are. So they're meant to be a public statement of what constitutes quality teaching. They're meant to define the work of teachers, make explicit the elements of high quality effective teaching in 21st century schools, provide a framework that describes the knowledge, practice and professional engagement required across teachers' careers, and provide a common language. So the standards were developed by AITSL, which is the Australian Institute of Teaching and School Leadership, and that's a nationwide body. And then it's implemented at a state level by the relevant organisations, which in New South Wales is BOSTES. So to give you an idea of how the standards are broken up, they've determined 4 career stages, which I'll talk about in a second. 3 domains. There are 7 standards that they believe teachers should be meeting in order to be considered an effective teacher, and 37 individual descriptors within the standards. So the 4 career stages are designed to try and help teachers progress throughout their career. There are 2 mandatory levels and then 2 voluntary levels of higher accreditation. So once you graduate from university, you receive the graduate teacher level, which is provisional accreditation, which is what I'm at the moment, and then you have to work towards proficient level, which is what I'm going towards this year. So that's the base mandatory level of accreditation. Then you've got voluntary higher levels, so highly accomplished teacher, and then lead teacher, and that's really for teachers that are in executive positions like your head of department, deputies, principals, etc. These are how they've broken up the standards. So the first one's about professional knowledge, and I think everyone here would agree this is critical. So the 2 elements of that are knowing your students and how they learn, and the second one is knowing your content. Okay, a lot of teachers are experts in their fields, but not necessarily good at the next part, which is professional practice, and that's being an effective teacher, being able to motivate students and engage them in their learning. And then the final one is about professional engagement. So that's not just thinking that you've taught for 10 years and therefore you're a perfect teacher. No, engaging in personal development, or professional development rather. So these are what the 7 standards look like, and we can reflect on these a little bit later on. But personally, I think they're a pretty good cross-section of what constitutes a good teacher. So the first one is know students and how they learn. Pretty self-explanatory. People learn in a variety of different ways, and you need to know the best ways in which your students learn in order to get the most out of them. The next one, also very critical, is to know your subject area. You'll see a lot of teachers try to wing it, not really experts in their field, therefore can't really be considered quality teaching. But those 2 alone are not enough to be an effective teacher. Some of the smartest teachers, most expert in their field, can be some of the worst as well. So you need to be able to plan and implement effective teaching. All right, so that's talking about behaviour management, being able to control the class, which can be really difficult. You can have lessons where you spend 50% on behaviour management and only 50% of the lesson actually teaching content. If you're not good at the behaviour management, then that ratio goes well out. Creating and maintaining supportive and safe learning environments, so that's really about things like bullying and cultural sensitivity. And then this one, Standard 5, is really critical, which is all about feedback and assessment. So creating quality assessment tasks, providing feedback to students on their learning, and also reporting. And that standard's probably the bulk of work that we do as teachers. It's very time consuming. I tell you, this weekend I'm writing 50 reports for Year 11, which are due on Monday. And then finally, we've got professional engagement. So that's not resting on your laurels and continuing to undertake professional development and engaging with your colleagues. So this is what they look like. These are publicly available. You can look on the ACARA website or on BOSTES as well. So this is the first standard, know students and how they learn. So they split them up into different little subsects within those standards. There's around 6 for each one, and then they divide them as well depending on what level of accreditation you're at. So if you've just graduated university, you're expected to be at that graduate level. Then when you're seeking proficient accreditation, you should be at proficient level, then highly accomplished, and finally lead teacher. So you can see here there's a focus on understanding how students learn, and there at graduate you just need to demonstrate knowledge and understanding of research, whereas at lead teacher you need to lead the process and evaluate. This is the second standard. You can see here the cross-curriculum priorities do come through, so there's a focus in Standard 2 about Indigenous issues and understand and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, as well as literacy and numeracy strategies, which they believe all teachers should be implementing regardless of their subject area. So not just English teachers teaching literacy, not just maths teachers teaching numeracy, but all teachers trying to incorporate those two things across their subject matter, and obviously using information and communication technology. So this is where it starts to get a bit complicated. So at the moment, it's only mandatory for teachers who have graduated or started teaching after the 1st of October 2004 to be accredited, or if you've been absent from teaching for 5 years or more. So if you're a teacher who's experienced and been teaching for a long period of time, you do not have to seek accreditation at the moment. However, that's going to change from 2018, and I'm going to explain how they've decided to bring this about. So basically how it works, to seek accreditation you have to be registered with BOSTES, you have to pay a $100 fee every year. Department which received a lot of criticism from the Teachers Federation. Then you have to seek your proficient accreditation as your base level, which you have to achieve within a certain time frame depending on whether you're temporary or permanent, and then you've got to maintain it. Then of course you can seek higher levels if you wish. So the way you achieve accreditation, and this is my biggest qualm with it, is that it's very, very simple. So you saw the 7 standards, you need to produce one piece of evidence per standard to show that you're meeting that standard. And one piece of evidence can be used to show that you're meeting more than one standard. So you could have 3 pieces of evidence in your portfolio to show that you're a proficient teacher. Then you need to annotate that evidence to show that you're meeting the standard. It's got to fit into one A4 sleeve, okay, so like this thin. So it's not exactly a rigorous process. At university now, all teaching degrees are very much teaching the language of the standards and how to achieve accreditation. So all new scheme teachers will find this a breeze, but more experienced teachers are a little bit daunted by this prospect. This is the trickier part, and this is maintaining your accreditation. So it runs in 5-year cycles. Within that 5 years, you have to complete 100 hours of professional development, and that's got to be logged in the system. So that can be like a discussion with your colleague about a student, could be professional development. Staff meeting at school could be professional development. So those are pretty easy to rack up. However, 50 of those hours have to be from external courses, and that's the trickier part. So in a few weeks, I'm going to an economics and business educators conference, so I can log the hours I've spent there towards my professional development hours. Then your principal has to verify that report. So this is where I'm a little bit disappointed with how accreditation's been rolled out. There's a lot of teachers that have been teaching for a long period of time. They're getting a bit stale, they don't have the passion anymore and are not achieving the greatest outcomes for their teachers. It's very difficult to get your first job in the teaching profession. Apart from in maths and science, there is an oversupply of teachers now. It's really difficult to get a job. Universities are churning out graduates and there's not enough jobs for them. Yet, there's old teachers in these roles who aren't vacating for these young, passionate people. So it was our hope that with the implementation of accreditation that some of these teachers would retire. So from 2018 onwards, it's going to be compulsory for all teachers to be accredited at proficient level in order to be able to teach. But instead of making these experienced pre-2004 teachers go through the same process, essentially their principal is just going to be able to tick off on them that because they've been teaching for so long, they're proficient teachers. However, they will have to maintain their accreditation, so they'll start having to pay the fee to Bosters and they will start having to do the 100 hours of professional development every 5 years. So I think that will act as a bit of a catalyst for some resignations of people who are, or retirements at retirement age, but I think it could have gone a little bit further. The next thing the government's tried to do with the standards is link it to pay. So this applies to new teachers, and this is our pay scale now, what it looks like. So a graduate teacher, not dependent on your degree, just graduate from university, is on $64,000, which for a graduate salary is pretty good, but for someone that's come to teaching after being in a previous profession, it's not the best salary, which is what I'm on now. Then you have to achieve proficient level, and then you get a massive pay jump to $77,000. So you can achieve your proficient accreditation realistically within 2 years, so you can jump up to $77,000 then. Then you're on that for 2 years and you automatically go up to 83.7 and then a year for each other step. So a year to proficient 2.2, then to 2.3. Then you have to seek the next level of accreditation, which is highly accomplished, to get up to over $100,000. So teacher pay has improved a lot with this standards-based pay. I think this is the government's way of trying to move towards performance-based teaching, but not to do it in a really dramatic, fast fashion that's going to annoy too many people. It's like a slow process. And I think that's the whole process with accreditation at the moment. Yes, it does seem quite light and easy, but the education profession can be a bit reluctant to change. So they're trying to do it in a slow and steady process. This is the old pay scale of what it looked like, if you're interested. So it started off at $47,000 in 2014 and the highest was $91,000. So it's improved a lot. That's just for a classroom teacher. If you're a principal or an executive, you're on a different pay scale altogether. So in terms of my thoughts and reflections on it, I think it's moving towards the right direction. It's really taken teachers away from this closed door policy where they can be in the classroom and have no accountability. Now with these accreditation reports, the principal does have to sign off on them and write them, so they're well within their rights now to come in and watch you teach. And that's really the only way to determine whether someone is an effective teacher. Some people can be fantastic at writing a document, completing a portfolio of work with wonderful looking worksheets that look fantastic. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're implementing quality teaching in the classroom. So having people coming in and watching you teach is really the only way I think that you're going to get that happening. And that's it from me.
So, the title of my speech is called Baby Steps in Education Policy, and I kind of say this with the knowledge that what I have to say will not be instinctively appealing to some of the people in this room, probably because it's not going to be radical enough or whatever, but experience has taught me that blowing up the education system is not realistic and therefore not really a worthwhile objective in the short to medium term. So from the outset, I want to say that my ambitions are relatively conservative. Oh, and for those of you who don't know, my work at CIS is pretty much entirely education policy, so the bulk of this speech is based off research that I've done on education policy and schools and things like that. So when I say experience, that's what I mean. What I present is an exploration of some of the main problems with the education system and some agile and innovative solutions to these problems. In short, our education system costs a lot, it isn't doing a very good job of educating kids, and it doesn't allow enough scope for all families to choose the type of education that's best for their child. Education spending across the entire country by both levels of government was $41 billion in 2004-05 and increased over $50 billion by 2013-14. Spending has increased steadily since then, and the so-called Gonski funding, which is also which requires both federal input, as we saw earlier in Simon's talk, and state government input as well, that represents another huge increase in recurrent funding. And the extent of future growth really kind of depends on which party wins on July 2, because both Liberal and Labor have relatively different commitments in terms of school spending. For all this spending, what have we got? And the answer is not a lot. Results from national and international testing show flat or declining results over time in basic skills. Between 2008 and 2004, NAPLAN testing, which is the national testing, in reading and numeracy shows that results for all year levels remained flat, with only a couple of exceptions. So like Year 9 reading, I think, showed like a small statistically significant improvement, and that was about it. The story is arguably a lot worse with the international testing. So mean scores in PISA, which is the Program for International Student Assessment, the testing for that showed that results in reading, maths and science have declined between 2000 and 2012, so that was mean scores across everyone. And the percentage of students achieving below the minimum standard has also increased over that time. So there are more students now doing less well. And there is a strong link to socioeconomic status, as most of us would expect, with the kids most likely to be below minimum standards also most likely to be disadvantaged. So it kind of necessitates us asking the question, if the purpose of public, universal, state-sponsored education beginning from the 19th century or so was to rescue poor children from illiteracy and innumeracy, it's obvious that the system's not doing a great job, and certainly not when you consider the money that's being spent on it. The problem for libertarians or classical liberals or whatever you want to call yourselves is that the issues with education cannot be fixed easily. Several aspects such as curricula, teachers, and obviously Sasha's just talked about one small piece of that puzzle, funding structures, decision-making processes, any number of other things, they all interlock to create this state of affairs. To the extent that they are subject to the control of different governments, so state and territory governments as well as the federal government, unpicking the system is quite difficult. So the more practical way to affect change that I can tell is to basically poke holes in the system. In this case, that means increasing school choice and diversity in the types of school that already exist, as well as driving policy change to create new types of education that can fill the gaps in the market. So it's not about trying to abolish public schools overnight. It's just about trying to slowly show people that there are different options that can also work. So obviously the current system has got a couple of problems. Some states have government school systems with more choice and autonomy. Others are much more centralised. New South Wales is one of the latter. I think it is possibly the most centralised education system in the country. And the New South Wales government has done precisely nothing to fix that. Sorry, Peter. The state of parental choice within the government sector is not great. In all states and territories, enrolment zones or priority enrolment areas are still enforced, and in most states and territories, children are designated to attend one particular government school determined by the area in which they live, unless their parents then choose to send them to a different school, obviously not a government school. An exception to this is selective schools. So New South Wales has academically selective schools, as well as a couple of performing arts, sports highs, and other states have similar policies but on a much smaller scale. They tend to not have enrolment zones. One simple option is to have more in different types of schools for different gifts and different talents for students, and they would be located in different areas. So for example, if you look at the distribution of academically selective schools in the Sydney area, you'll see that they are mostly concentrated in areas where the children are the most advantaged anyway. So the chances of those kids going to a school, their local government school, being pretty good are pretty high anyway, whereas it's the opposite for the kids who are in relatively poor areas. Their government schools are pretty crap and they don't exactly have they don't have other options. And so these overlapping enrolment zones are also a good idea, but charter schools are better still. So in other countries, including the US, England, and New Zealand, charter schools and similar school policies, so partnership schools, free schools, they're subject to less regulation by governments when compared to Australian non-government schools. This is even though charter schools technically fall under the public sector umbrella because they are fully government funded, so they can't charge fees, and they're not allowed to be selective in their student body. A review of the empirical literature on charter schools and similar policies reveals small average positive impacts on school achievement, but much stronger positive impacts on disadvantaged students in particular. Most charter schools are run by non-profit organisations, but some are also run by for-profit companies. There is no clear evidence either way on the impact of charter school profit status on educational outcomes. I'm happy to talk more about for-profit schools in general in Q&A if people are interested. Charter schools offer an alternative to school zoning policies, which frequently lock poor students to poorly performing government schools that have, and this is, I think, the clincher for me, that have little control over the key levers to improve their students' performance. In theory, the non-government school sector should be the best option to increase choice and diversity, but the reality is a little different. Though they are sometimes referred to as private schools, this is a misnomer. They are non-government in that they are managed and run by non-government organisations, the Catholic school system, other religious groups such as Anglican, Lutheran, Muslim, or alternative education systems like Steiner or Montessori. But they still receive government funding and as a result are required to use the same curriculum and hire teachers accredited with state boards, as Sasha explained. The presence of fees ranging from fairly affordable to simply huge, and the fact that they are currently either of a religious or a hippie nature, pretty much exclusively one of those two, means they're not viable or attractive for many families. In the case of charter schools, the level of government that you deal with is the state government because they're public schools. But non-government schools are largely within the purview of the federal government, and this means that Australia's relatively confused take on schools in a federalist system also presents an opportunity for people like me to effect change at the federal level. There are certain barriers to operating a non-government school on the same terms as those who are currently already in the system. Existing players have a body of knowledge concerning the needs of the market, and more importantly, how best to conform to government rules. So curriculum, teachers, all those sorts of things that you need to know in order to be eligible for public funding. The federal government could play a role in ameliorating some of these hurdles to entry by providing more information, like New Schools Guide. They've worked in other countries, and I think they could possibly work here as well. So the intended result is more non-government schools that are secular and more that have low enough fees that they are accessible to poor families whose choices are so constrained. This would create a similar effect to charter schools, albeit with some key differences, but by working with a different tier of government and within a different school sector. And I apologise to all of the federalists in the room, but you got to do what you got to do. Though a combination of these policies could create the school level change that gives rise to a constituency for change at the system level, there are still children and families for whom it wouldn't mean much of a difference. That's because they have decided that traditional schooling is not the best thing for their kids. Of course, the fundamental problem for most families is that non-traditional options such as homeschooling, distance education, or mixed provision simply aren't financially viable. When you compare the out-of-pocket costs or the opportunity costs of one parent staying at home to provide education compared to a fully or significantly subsidised education in the traditional sector, whether it be public, whether it be government or non-government, it's a difficult choice to justify. So there are a few policy options that have been tried in the United States that might offer solutions. The first is an education tax credit. Education tax credits are a broad family of programs whereby a party can dedicate a particular sum of money to education fees and is able to reduce their tax liability by the same amount. So there are two main kinds. One is the scholarship model, which operates much more similarly to the traditional sort of a voucher model, where educational costs for disadvantaged children are paid for out of the tax liability of a corporation or an individual, and the voucher model, where parents pay their children's educational costs out of their tax liability, and this could be used for other things too. You might say that vouchers for traditional and non-traditional schoolers alike are the answer, or why don't we just have vouchers like Milton Friedman originally suggested? Unfortunately, it's not a very practical idea. because the Australian practice of providing some public funding to non-government schools, combined with the complexities of the federal system, federal state cost sharing, cost shifting issues, means vouchers would be extraordinarily expensive, crowd out private investment in education, which so many parents are already willing to do, and are unlikely to contribute significantly to choice and diversity. In any case, Friedman had better ideas. He wanted to move beyond school choice and to what he called educational choice. In 2003, Friedman emphasised that education could develop in several ways, asking, why is it sensible for a child to get all of his or her schooling in one brick building? Why not add partial vouchers? Why not let them spend part of a voucher for math in one place and English and science somewhere else? A policy tool that has gained traction is the Education Savings Account, which provides a way to make Friedman's idea a reality. ESAs involve money that is transferred from the government to parents, generally of the same or similar amount that the student will be entitled to if they attended a public school. These funds are then used by parents to purchase a variety of education-related goods and services. Because the leftover funds from ESAs can also be used for college savings, the funds in an ESA are more like one's own money, and this obviously recalls Friedman's old saying about the 4 types of spending. Spending one's own money on one's own children creates an incentive for value-driven spending in a way that other policies, even vouchers, can't. So obviously these are both radical propositions when you consider the current state of education policy. Nevertheless, both have the potential to be carefully implemented on a small scale and could be especially beneficial for children with special needs and for whom traditional schooling is not an effective option. Which is not to advocate a totally laissez-faire approach. It is important to ensure that schools and education options are accountable for the use of taxpayer dollars and for the quality of education that they provide. However, with proper accountability measures in place, choice and diversity are preferable to centralisation and enforced uniformity. Though our complex federal system may seem like an example of big government, the silver lining is that we have plenty of governments to choose from when it comes to policy experiments. If we can get small-scale trials of one of these policy options in a single place, then others may follow. If the community can be shown that these diverse options can work and can deliver for both students and taxpayers, then the holes that we poke can get bigger and bigger. And then there's little need to worry about blowing up 9 different education departments. They'll just become obsolete. Thanks.
Hello, hi, my name's Claire. I'll be talking about something a little bit different. I'm going to talk about ideology within the academy. My talk is called Social Justice Warriors in the Academy. The reason I think that particularly left-wing bias is a problem in the university system, the reason I think it's a problem is it's bad for students when students go to university and they study particular disciplines which are more prone to this bias than others, because they don't develop the critical thinking skills that they ought to be exposed to. It's bad for scholarship because it skews scholarship into one direction, an ideological direction. And it's bad for staff, faculty and researchers, particularly if they don't conform to the prevalent ideology that their institution sort of upholds. So in my talk I'm going to quickly talk about one paper that was published a couple of years ago, which sort of typifies the ideology that is sort of growing and manifesting within the university system. And then I'm going to talk about what I call unfalsifiable narratives. So these are narratives which are of a left-wing bent that you can't prove wrong, no matter how much evidence you develop to the contrary or can show to the contrary. Some of these narratives just persist. And I will argue that it's because of a political monoculture that exists within the academy. When I say academy, I don't mean the entire university system. I'm referring more to the social sciences. My area is psychology. disciplines such as anthropology, sociology, anything like gender studies, anything with the studies on the end of it. These are the disciplines I'm talking about. I know that there are other disciplines such as law and perhaps economics that aren't so biased, but yeah, so that's what I mean when I say the academy. Okay, so one of the most egregious examples of bias is typified by a paper which came out a couple of years ago called NASA Faked the Moon Landing, Therefore Climate Science is a Hoax. This study was authored by Stephen Lewandowski from the University of Western Australia. Some people are nodding their heads. What he did was he surveyed people that are in the climate skeptic community, so people that read blogs online. And what he wanted to do was prove that these people are more prone to conspiracy theory type thinking than other people, than the average population. And he surveyed, I'll just read to you his abstract. We show that endorsement of a cluster of conspiracy theories, such as that the CIA killed Martin Luther King or that NASA faked the moon landing, predicts rejection of climate science as well as the rejection of other scientific findings, above and beyond commitment to laissez-faire free markets. This provides confirmation of previous suggestions that conspiracist ideation underlies the rejection of science. Okay, so he surveyed 1,145 people. Out of these people, and these are all members of the climate skeptic community, only 10 actually thought the moon landing was a hoax. This is fewer than what you would find in the general population. So 97.8% of people who thought that climate science was not, who are skeptics about climate science, 97.8% of these people did not also think that the moon landing was a hoax. So the real result was the opposite of what the abstract stated. It was the opposite of the title of the paper. Now, this paper was picked up and it was distributed and publicised in mainstream media all over the world. It was a big news story. The researcher that uncovered this misrepresentation, I think there were more than one, but one of the researchers, his name is Jose Duarte, and he's a self-identified libertarian. He had to request Lewandowski's data set and investigate the data independently because the correlations were so they were obfuscated within the original paper. Now, the author's political motivations for publishing a paper like this are fairly obvious, but it is the lax attitude on behalf of peer reviewers that lies at the heart of the problem within the academy. Some subfields, such as social psychology, which this paper comes from, have become communities where political values and moral aims are shared, and they're fields in which where left-wing narratives are disproportionately overrepresented in the literature. I went to a talk last year given by a social psychologist called Lee Jussim, where he said that within his field, social psychology, those on the left outnumber those on the right by a ratio of about 10-1. This is according to the surveys that they've done. This skew means that even if left-leaning and right-leaning scientists, even if they are equal in their bias, that would mean that at least 10 times more research biased towards validating left-wing narratives than conservative narratives is being produced. And then when you add in the double standard in the peer review process, where studies validating left-wing narratives are easier to publish, then the bias within the field vastly exceeds the ratio of 10-1. In other words, research is becoming an exercise in groupthink. Okay, so another word for groupthink is confirmation bias. What is confirmation bias? It is what we do when we search for evidence that confirms our pre-existing beliefs and ignoring disconfirming evidence in the process. It is widespread amongst all of us, lay people and scientists alike. Even educated and intelligent people are highly prone to confirmation bias. The problem is that confirmation bias becomes exacerbated when we confront questions that trigger our moral intuitions, and our tribal identity. And this bias becomes exacerbated again if we find ourselves in an echo chamber. Now this might be beneficial if you are a political organisation or a religious group or an activist group, but it is devastating if you are part of a community which purports to seek the truth. And academia purports to do that. Okay, so I've got my 5-minute warning. It is not uncommon for academics to list the promotion of social justice as a research topic on their CVs. One academic, whose name is John Jost at New York University, and he's done the studies which apparently prove that conservatives have lower IQs and are more authoritarian, that kind of thing. Anyway, he runs what he calls the Social Justice Lab. So within parts of the scientific community, the blending of science with political activism is far from being frowned upon. But political activism should be the last thing that a scientist engages in. You only have to look at Twitter to see scientists tweeting about white privilege, women in STEM, structural disadvantage, affirmative action, and so on. A particular topic that I've focused on in my own writing in recent years has been the narrative of the oppression of women. It is a popular narrative within the academy, it's a popular narrative within the sciences, even when disconfirming evidence comes out to the contrary. Last year, some brave psychologists, Wendy Williams and Stephen Ceci, published a 67-page review called Women in Academic Science, A Changing Landscape. They found that for women in the sciences, gender fairness rather than gender bias was the norm, and that the biggest barrier for women was that they saw academic jobs as being incompatible with family formation. Now this is common sense in a mainstream society, but within the academy, this is a fringe view, and these researchers were vilified and attacked. They were attacked for victim blaming, and people said that scholarship like this would do nothing except reinforce the institutional bias against women for decades. So the point is that if you do not conform, and if your research does not validate or add to the popular narratives within this political and moral community, your career can suffer, you can be personally attacked. That's bad for the researchers involved, that's bad for students, and it's bad for broader society. The reason I wanted to draw your attention to biased scholarship is that most of this research is funded by the taxpayer. It's funded by us if it's carried out in Australian universities. In America, it's funded by the American taxpayers. We're not supposed to be funding political activism. We're supposed to be funding researchers who are trying to uncover the truth. And so that's why I think it's particularly important to point out these ideological biases within these learning institutions. I don't know what the answer to this problem is. I was a graduate student at an Australian university, but I've left to pursue a career at a research institute, and I've begun an online publishing platform, and I've promoted the work of researchers, particularly from America, whose work is unpopular, so whose work upsets these dominant left-wing narratives. And it's proven popular. There's a market for it. There's a lot of right-wing intellectuals who have interesting things to say about controversial topics and who just want to contribute but haven't been given the space or the platform to do so, at least within the monoculture of academia. Another website that is trying to do the same thing is the Heterodox Academy in the US. If you just Google it, heterodoxacademy.org. It was started by a group of American scholars such as Lee Jussim, Jonathan Haidt, and Jose Duarte, who I mentioned earlier, who want to save their disciplines from groupthink and who want to pursue research on controversial topics. When I say controversial, anything that's not left-wing is controversial in academia, in these disciplines. And they also want to give support to graduate students or undergraduate students who might feel like they're in a slightly hostile environment because their political views don't match up with everybody else's. Yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, everyone. I have a question particularly for Claire. I think it's definitely very true that there is significant left-wing bias in certain fields of academia, but I was wondering why you think that bias exists and why it's so much easier for left-wing voices and left-wing narratives to come out and have such a strong voice in academia compared to conservative or libertarian narratives.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think there's an easy answer. I think there's probably self-selection going on, but that's not the only factor. There was a study done in 2012 by Inbar and Lammers which showed that they asked faculty in America whether if they had job applications from people who are equally qualified, whether they'd go with the progressive, a person who identified as progressive or whose research validated progressive topics or narratives. This survey found that overwhelmingly faculty said that they would discriminate and they would not hire conservatives. And they also found that people were quite happy to... These are people who are against discrimination in any other... You know, they abhor discrimination against women, against racial minorities, but they're happy to say that they would discriminate against people because of their political views. So there is research that active discrimination is happening. I think it's probably self-selection has a lot to do with it because perhaps conservatives and libertarians want to go into private industry because it pays more, you know, and I think, you know, it's not only because of discrimination, but I think if you're a student or a graduate student and your views are in the minority and are sort of being laughed at or not taken seriously, I think it'd be really easy to look around for other job opportunities, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Mostly to Sasha, but also to Trisha if she wants to step in. One of the major criticisms of school education in Australia today is the overweening reliance on, you know, the self-esteem principle. So when you get reports, you know, your child gets a B and they are working constructively and steadily towards desired outcomes. There's no objective standard by which you can measure your child on the basis of class or form assessment. There's no figure in relation to marks actually achieved. To what extent has the education system been devalued by this desire to not harm every precious snowflake?
Well, I can tell you, my father comes from the Czech Republic where they have a system where students are ranked from 1 to 5. 1's the best, 5's failing abysmally. And he used to have this issue every parent-teacher interview, and he would say to my teachers, rank her on a scale of 1 to 5 of how she's going. And like, oh no, we can't do that, sir. Like, so yes, it's problematic. I mean, we've got these different words. The bottom one is progressing. That translates to failing miserably. However, it really does depend on your school and your teacher. Like I said, I'm in the middle of writing reports at the moment, and you do have to be a little bit careful with your language, but I guess it's really in the comments where you can reflect how the student's going, and also the teacher making effort to contact the parents personally to inform them of how their student is going. I can tell you on senior reports you do publish their mark, so that gives a pretty blanket view of how they're going. But yeah, some of this terminology and the supposed need to protect students is concerning. I mean, there were some students I was hearing about the other day in primary school who are excusing themselves from NAPLAN testing because it was too much for them. And how is that going to set them up for later life for HSC?
You know what's stressful? Not being able to read. I think there's absolutely kind of some kind of mutual feedback loop going on, because I think, to kind of draw on what Claire was saying as well, I mean, there's a lot of lefties who would run teacher training courses as well. And so there's this whole, I guess the relationship between that sort of special snowflake stuff and left-wing ideology is pretty clear, but then like that filters through to teachers, then that informs their teaching practices, but then also it's coming externally from parents as well. I mean, I remember when I was in school, I went to a Catholic school for a couple of years in primary school, and I think it was in year 1 or year 2, and like my teachers started setting, really small homework tasks. And then after about a term or two, they got rid of it. And then my parents at the next teacher interview were like, why'd you get rid of the homework? It was great. And then she was like, oh, too many parents complained about, their kids getting homework. And then, so I think that there is this, obviously schools in some ways produce that sort of thing, but it's also driven by external factors as well. And you would have to, I think there are really obvious reasons why. Like one of the things you could say is that if governments are so desperate to, ban playgrounds, that local councils won't build certain playgrounds in a certain way because a kid might fall off and die, or more likely just break their arm. It comes back to a general culture of cosseting and cotton wool kids. So the education system reinforces that, but it's not the primary driver.
My question's actually primarily to Sasha. Having just received my QTC accreditation from Bosties for a course, are you aware and would you comment on the costs to the private sector to be part of the teacher accreditation process, and how much of the documentation is actually done by the supplier of this accreditation rather than from the, fortunately, the taxpayer's purse?
Truthfully, I have no idea of what the figures are and the cost to the private sector, but I'm sure it's a lot. But I can tell you, it's not just government schools that have to go through the accreditation process. Non-government school teachers have to be accredited through the BOSTES process as well, and meet all their reporting requirements as well. So there would be considerable cost involved.
It's the private supplier of the accreditation course who does all the paperwork so that the teachers can give their little ones a...
Well, my understanding, because I'm going through it at the moment, is the principal writes our report and then passes it off to the department. What happens to it after then, I'm not sure, but that's how it works in schools.
Thanks to all the panellists. Chris Ashton, we always hear a lot about the bad results in Australian education, literacy especially, and Trish spoke to that. We've never had so much funding in our schools. We've never had class sizes so small. And I think it's right to say we've never had such intrusive regulation of curriculum, schools and teachers. And so my question to Sasha, it's a three-part question, you'll be pleased to know. As a Libertarian, should we be encouraged by the teacher accreditation process that you outlined? Should it be in place for non-government schools? And what would you say to the charge that this regulation only adds to the silliness that I often encounter? I'm not a teacher, but I'm a director of an independent school. I often conduct teacher interviews for teacher candidates, the problem I find is that teachers know a lot about standards 1, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7, and comparatively little about standard 2, know the content and how to teach it. Arguably the most important standard, and I would say the only essential standard. So, Libertarians, why should we like what you said? Private schools, should they apply? And what about standard 2?
Okay, so to start off with, why should you like teacher accreditation? Purely from the basis that there are so many teachers that can just coast through and do the absolute bare minimum without any checks or balances on what they're doing at all. And yes, it does fly a bit in the face of libertarian ideology. However, these people are educating our students, and it's a real worry to see what they can do. I say teaching is similar to politics in terms of pay, where if you're super lazy, then it's fantastic pay because you turn up, you do the bare minimum, go to Parliament on sitting days only, or for teaching, you turn up for your classes, do nothing when you come home. But if you're a hard-working teacher, you're a hard-working politician, then it's really crap pay because you spend hours preparing your lessons or hours talking to constituents. So in order to ensure that we do have good quality teachers in there, I think there do need to be some checks and balances monitoring what teachers are doing in the classroom and what they're teaching our students. Do I think that private schools should be exempt from accreditation? I don't know, that remains to be seen. We'll see how the accreditation actually goes when it's implemented fully across different schools. I mean, some independent schools are probably equally as guilty, if not more guilty, than some government schools in employing poor teachers, even though they have more ability to hire and fire staff than government schools do. It really depends on how the teacher accreditation goes and whether you believe in the standards, and I think the standards are generally pretty good, and whether they make it a bit more rigorous. Back to standard 2, so knowing the content and how to teach it. Obviously that is a critical factor in being a good teacher, is knowing your subject matter. Okay, not enough teachers do know it very well. However, you have to remember that the level at which you are teaching, especially if you're teaching to junior students, so like I'm a high school teacher, so if you're teaching to 7 to 10, you're not teaching everything that you know about that subject area because it's just too much for them, it's not the syllabus. And I've actually struggled sometimes the most with the subject matter that I know the best. So I was teaching Cold War to Year 10, which is my favourite topic area, I've done a lot of study in it, and it just went well over their heads because I wanted to give them every piece of information that I had and give them that knowledge, but at that level it's just too much. So sometimes the smartest teachers who know the best are not great at getting that information to the students. So yes, you do need to know your subject matter, but being a good educator and having good pedagogy is equally as important. If you've got all the information there but your kids aren't listening to you and they're running riot in the classroom, then none of that information is going to go in. And that's definitely the hardest part of teaching. Like, learning the subject matter is not too difficult. Trying to actually be a good classroom practitioner, I can tell you, is extremely difficult, and dealing with the different personalities.
Hello, I'm a graduate teacher from Queensland. On my very first day of teacher education, my lecturer he was an English teacher lecturer, but he spent about 10-15 minutes absolutely bashing the IPA. I had another lecturer do, a good 2 hours on closing the gap for the stolen generation. None of that, as a recent graduate, has really made me any better in the classroom. So I guess my question is, how much of a problem is it if this same bias at university, it's going into the teacher education sphere, and then in terms of teacher accreditation, that's all very centralised. So is there a risk that we are creating a culture of very left-wing, very politically correct teachers that are so out of touch with the students they teach, and how much of a danger is that for our society?
So in terms of university teacher education courses, 100% agree with you. There's a lot of academic bias in there, a lot of, in my opinion, irrelevant stuff being taught. I've had the same experience on my first day doing my master's, meeting the lecturer in charge of teaching economics and business. She went on a rant about how her key topic issue is Palestinian refugees and how Israel is trying to kill Palestinian babies. And I didn't see any relevance whatsoever to the economics or business studies curriculum in any way. This same lecturer then dedicated a week to Indigenous studies as part of the teaching economics and business course, and was talking about the Northern Territory intervention and how it was basically a military dictatorship. And when I questioned her, asked me what my name was, and said she was shocked that such views still existed in our civilised society. So, and I didn't think what I said was controversial at all. But funnily enough, every single person in that room was on my side, even the left-wing students. They said to me, like, being treated like that by a lecturer is appalling. And I'd been a well-seasoned university student by this point, but if I'd been in my first year, I probably would have broken down in tears, like being singled out like that in a lecture. So my biggest concern with that is that A, it will deter good teachers away from pursuing the profession, but B, it's just wasted time when there's so much else you need to be learning when you're going into the classroom. Like, so many graduates are just underprepared for what teaching is really like. You spend all this time learning about all these academic theories and political stuff which isn't relevant. But nitty-gritty behaviour management, how do you control a class, how do you make your lessons interesting, and learning about the content that you're supposed to teach doesn't seem to have much of a place anymore, which is unfortunate. I mean, where you learn all your craft is on your pracs while you're actually teaching. And then definitely needs to be a higher emphasis on that. I mean, so it's definitely a concern for me.
From a policy perspective, like when I was saying that there are like several different things that all lock together, this is one of the things that I was talking about. So like one of the reasons that we've got the kind of the fairly intrusive regulation, accreditation, standards, whatever for teachers is because they're trying to frantically to fix after the fact that the system is producing a lot of teachers who are poorly qualified, probably shouldn't have done teaching to begin with, and are just not suited to be teachers. So a lot of the accreditation and all that sort of stuff is in response to that. And then at the same time, you've got a resistance amongst, I think, people like us to be more generous in the way that we pay teachers, because we can see that there's so much fat in the system. And then this also comes back to the fact that how do you actually attract? I mean, I've always seen like 100 people like, oh, I go to education conferences and I hear people say, how do we attract quality high school graduates or undergraduates to a career in teaching? And it's like, maybe you should have like a career that actually allows for some professional development, because if you're ambitious, like is the kind of thing that Sasha described really going to be appealing to you? I think for a lot of people, they'll just be like, well, why would I do that? Why would I go into a system where like I can be treated more or less the same way as, if I'm really good at my job, I can be treated more or less the same way as the teacher next door who can be crap. And so a lot of these things... Yeah, exactly. All of these things sort of fit together, and so you kind of have to... Initial teacher education is one of the things that the government's looking at. So there was a TMAG, Teacher Education Ministerial Advisory Group. They produced a report that basically said a lot of the courses that people are offering are crap. They stopped short of mandating a minimum ATAR. I think I'm curious to know what Andrew's view on that is. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, because I think that there are other ways to fix the market, but there is action being taken on that. One of the things that I hope will happen is that prospective teacher education students prospective teaching students will be able to learn more about the types of courses that are on offer and which ones are good, which ones are bad. The government's already doing something like that for university in general. It's called the Quality Indicators in Learning and Teaching. So that's for tertiary students in general. And so hopefully at some point we can drive a teacher education system that's much more responsive to the needs of both students who are coming in and to the employment that waits on the other side.
I'll be quick. I'm glad you brought up political correctness. It's a huge problem, and it should be stamped out in the teaching profession. Teachers should not be blending social work with teaching. If they're going into a classroom, they should be. I know this is not realistic, but they should acknowledge if something is their opinion, rather than treating their opinion as fact or evidence. And I do think it stems from the problem of ideological bias within the universities, which I don't think has always been there. I think it's come probably since the 1970s. I think prior to the 1970s and the creation of these various studies disciplines like gender studies and various other cultural studies, I think prior to that there was more of a respect for just basic principles of education, such as teaching logic and history, and that's a lot of the humanities areas have become politicised, and so now we've got this blending of political activism, social work and teaching, which is bad news. Bad news for everyone, it's bad news for students, and I think it's very good that you can recognise that as a young teacher.
Yes.
Quickly, Andrew, did you have a view on minimum ATARs for ITE?
Generally, I'm not in favour of government regulation of ATAR. I don't think they've got the level of information they need to know who should be admitted to a particular course or not. The one thing they are doing in teaching is that I think from the middle of this year, before someone becomes a teacher, they'll have to pass a literacy and numeracy test, which... Pardon? Shocking, which puts them in the top 30% of the population. I don't know if that's the right level or not, but certainly that will be a barrier to some people who have historically got into teacher courses that shouldn't have got into those courses.
Given that, this is for the panel, given you got like everything like from lynda.com, Code Academy, like I've taught myself Python in about 8 hours. Like I could give that to a 10-year-old kid and get him a code job, like if he learned that stuff. Do you guys reckon, and they're all like monthly memberships of like $30-40, do you guys reckon you could have private education like done on a mass scale online just to get out of the system, given you guys are like ambitious and entrepreneurs?
I could sort of say something about that in higher education. One thing interesting thing is that 2012 there was a huge obsession around online education, the year of the MOOC. Various vice chancellors were panicking, they're about to go out of business. We did a report saying don't worry about it, and 4 years later on that's a pretty good conclusion. So you have to think about what product are these educational institutions actually selling. And I think for schools, and particularly for school leaver undergraduates, the sort of classroom education is only one component of a much broader experience they're trying to get from their education. And for that reason, even though every education institution is using online technologies, it's not going to be replaced by online because that's actually a different product. It's fine if you just want to fill a gap in your knowledge, but it's not going to replace the broader socialisation experience of the school or the university.
The only other thing that I would add is that it also doesn't, I think, necessarily acknowledge the vastly different skill levels that exist. I mean, most people in this room are most likely to be fairly self-starting, motivated people. For others, it's not the case, and there needs to be very specific and very targeted and explicit instruction happening to at least get kids to a basic level where they can then go off to, use MOOCs or learn stuff from Khan Academy or wherever else.
Yeah, I agree with Trish in that there's individual differences in terms of students' readiness to self-teach and learn on their own. But for smart, talented kids, I think it's fantastic that technology is giving, particularly teenagers and uni students, you can go online and you can watch lectures given by professors at MIT, people that you would not have access to if you were in rural Australia. And I think there's a real issue of over-enrolment in universities in Australia, which is diluting standards. And then over in America, they've got problems with degrees costing an arm and a leg and kids going into debt to get these degrees. So I think shorting that and using technology to break down some of those barriers is fantastic. Yeah. And smart kids are just going to do it naturally. They're just going to be able to access online learning and watch lectures from their favourite professors, and that's just going to happen organically.